again, we might just like in the case of solidarity, we might ask, cannot this be reduced to the persons? Because the persons need to believe that in that authority, or need to want to follow authority, or need to not desire to rebel against authority. And yes, they will have feelings, just like there were feelings of solidarity and cold calculations of reciprocity. Here there are different reasons why people obey. Some may obey because their parents were in the civil service, and they join the civil service, and they think it's their duty to help their nation, and they obey because they believe in the goals of the organization. Others just signed a 9-to-5 contract, and they say, hey man, I'm obeying just because from 9 to 5, you're paying me money, and I'm going to obey you. But at 5 o'clock, I'm going to tell you to go screw yourself, right? Or, in other words, there are many different motives for obeying. But that doesn't mean that legitimacy of authority is not a property of the institutional organization itself. Now, the main person, the main theoretician who studies legitimacy is a German sociologist from the turn of the century, well, the turn of the past century. His name is Max Weber. Max Weber is a fabulous author. His works are still worthwhile reading. He's one of my favorite sociologists. And it is known as the sociologist who first theorized questions of legitimacy. And he says there are 3 sources of legitimacy for authority. The simplest one that occurs in very small organizations is one that derives from the charisma of the leader. That's the simplest one and the most primitive form. Here you might think of the organization of Al-Qaeda, particularly the original Al-Qaeda following Bin Laden. Bin Laden had plenty of charisma. He had fought in Afghanistan. He was from a nice royal family, or not royal family, but a rich family in Saudi Arabia. He had shown himself, he had shown character, displayed character during the resistance of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So he had the credentials, the personal credentials, plus I'm sure he is a good orator when it comes to quoting the Quran and things like that. He had all the personal characteristics to be a leader, and at the beginning, many people in Al-Qaeda followed him just because he had those characteristics. But as Weber explains, charisma is a very unstable form of legitimacy. For one thing, it lends itself to succession crises. The moment the charismatic leader dies, it is very hard to find another charismatic leader because not everybody's charismatic, right? I mean, everybody's been waiting for Fidel Castro to die. The guy apparently is like the brain that wouldn't die. You know, like Fidel Castro is dead. It bounces back. You know, he's like Michael from like Friday the 13th or something. You know, you stab him to death, you crush his skull, and you turn around, the guy comes back to life. But the problem everybody was wondering with Fidel Castro is who is going to replace him. Because Fidel Castro governed in many respects through his own personal charisma and his oratory powers. His brother doesn't have any charisma. He's like the anti-charismatic Fidel Castro. So charisma as a source of legitimacy is unstable. So Max Weber says, very early on in the history of Egypt and in the history of Mesopotamia, charisma was made hereditary. In other words, a myth was created that said that charisma was in the blood, and therefore a bloodline, a royal bloodline, could now commence, even if the son or daughter of the king, a charismatic king, was like a complete idiot, he had a right to the throne. And at that moment, what he calls traditional legitimacy is born. Traditional legitimacy is the legitimacy in religious organizations. Traditional, like the Vatican or your regular church or your regular monastery. It's also the legitimacy in aristocratic societies, because it's the legitimacy of the king, the legitimacy of the royal line, and the legitimacy of the barons and the princes and the other, the dukes and the other members of the aristocracy, each one as part of a hierarchy, of an authority hierarchy. Legitimacy, traditional legitimacy, is typically also based on the existence of a sacred text that has a narrative that explains how God gave the king the power to have that authority. In other words, the king is a god, as in Egypt, for instance, or the king, as in the case of Louis XIV in France in the 17th century. The king was given the right to govern by God. Either way, there's typically some kind of sacred text with a narrative, which is typically a myth, a narrative that explains how that particular form of legitimacy came to be and why it is now transmitted through the bloodline. Finally, there's a third source of legitimacy, which is the legitimacy of bureaucracies, bureaucratic agencies in government. Bureaucracies, of course, were born. There were already bureaucracies in Egypt. I've been studying lately the building of the pyramids in Egypt, and you needed specialized departments in the government of Egypt to, control the logistics of where to bring the stone, how to coordinate the workers, how to design the pyramid. But they come on their own in at least in the West in the 19th century, at the end of which Max Weber was writing. Bureaucracies get their only source of legitimacy is their being able to get things done, their capacity to actually get things done. For example, in the United States, the legitimacy of the president comes both from the Constitution, which is a text, and from its having been elected and therefore being representative of the voters. The legitimacy of congressmen and senators also comes both from the Constitution and from having been elected officials. But the people who work in bureaucracies are not elected officials. They are professional bureaucrats. They are technocrats with a career. They were never elected. They were simply picked by a president. And bureaucracies are not mentioned in the Constitution. There's not a single word in the American Constitution about bureaucracies. So bureaucracies don't have any source of textual or traditional legitimacy in the United States, with the exception of getting things done. So let me give you an example. When New Orleans was flooded in 2006, was it 2006? 2005, right? In 2005, God, how many years have gone by? It seems like yesterday. When Katrina hit New Orleans, FEMA lost legitimacy. It lost legitimacy because it was Monday and all those stranded survivors were claiming for the government to show up. Then it was Tuesday and the same stranded survivors claimed for the government to show up and didn't show up. Wednesday came Thursday, and only on Friday FEMA finally shows up with help and food for the survivors, and even then it made a mess of the rescue. Because the only source of legitimacy for FEMA or any other kind of bureaucratic agency is getting things done. FEMA did not get things done, it lost legitimacy. Right now, in the eyes of most American people, if they tell you, well, I'm an officer from FEMA, really, and you feel proud of that? It doesn't have any legitimacy. It will reacquire legitimacy the next catastrophe if it manages to do things perfectly. Because now it needs to show itself in practice that it can get things done. Okay, guys, I'm going to return to this point after the break. Let's make it 10 minutes exactly because I have an entire social world.